Hey y'all, it's crime time. Welcome to my new series, Still Doing Makeup. This episode, the first episode, we're talking about a crime that's been long forgotten. This crime was committed in the 60s, the early 1960s. Her name was Sylvia Likens, the victim, and that poor girl. She was only 16. But let's get into the meat and potatoes of this crime, okay? Let's start at the beginning. Sylvia Likens was born on January 3rd, 1949, to two sets of twins, being the middle one, in Boone County. Sylvia came from a large but poor family. Her parents are Lester Likens and Elizabeth Francis. They lived, like I said, in Boone County, which is just northwest of Indianapolis. So, Lester, her father, had an 8th grade education, and so therefore he had to work a lot of different jobs. Laundry routes, factories. He even owned a restaurant once, but no, I said owned. It wasn't successful. So Elizabeth and Lester, in the summer of 1965, were working in, they traveled with carnivals selling food out of concession carts. So, like I said, summer of 1965, they decided to go back to doing that because they were doing it for a while and then they stopped, bouncing around, but they decided to go back to doing that. The oldest daughter, Diana, was already grown and married, and the two boys, Danny and Benny, were placed with their grandparents. So that just left Sylvia and her younger sister, Jenny. And Jenny was paralyzed, partially paralyzed from polio since birth. So that was just a thing that they had to deal with, the family had to deal with as Jenny got older. Sylvia, on the other hand, she was normal, I guess, comparatively, and she was very outgoing, while Jenny was very shy and timid. And Sylvia had a lot of friends. They like to call her Cookie, which, I don't know why, but you go, girl. Jenny and Sylvia were left to being, the parents needed to find some place for them to go while they traveled with the circus. On July 3rd of that summer, their mother was arrested and jailed for shoplifting. And so Lester arranged for Sylvia and Jenny to be boarded with a woman named Gertrude Baniszewski. And I'll put that on the screen so you know what I'm saying. So Gertrude was introduced to the Likens through a mutual friend, and we hate that mutual friend. Just putting that, we hate them for doing this. But so Lester decided that he would pay Gertrude $20 a week to watch his kids. And Gertrude was saying, "Oh, I'll treat them like my own. Don't worry about them. They'll be safe with me." So let's talk about old Gertie, shall we? Gertrude Baniszewski. She dropped out of high school at a young age to marry John Baniszewski, who was 18 at the time. They would go on to have 4 kids. And John wasn't just your average Joe Schmo type of guy. He was abusive, and which doesn't excuse Gertrude's later on behavior, which you'll find out, but he was abusive. And so they had 4 kids and ended up divorcing after 10 years. Then Gertrude remarried a guy named Edward. That's right. A guy named Edward. They were only married for about 3 months, and then she divorced him to go back to John, who continued to abuse her. but it didn't last. They had 2 more children and they divorced a second time in 1963. So Gertie, our friend Gertie here, doesn't really have a best record with men. So Gertrude already had 7 children on her own after she married Dennis. She had Paula, John, Stephanie, Marie, Shirley, James, and Dennis. Yeah, I know. Dennis was the youngest. Well, James and Dennis were the youngest. They were 18 months old. And Dennis, I believe, was named, well, obviously named after his father, Dennis Wright. And I'm not sure if the other child, James, was also named after him, but that's not really important. So yeah. Every week, like I said before, Sylvia and Jenny's parents would pay Gertrude $20 a week to take care of them. Well, one week, the money didn't come on the day that was expected. So Gertrude, and there's a article somewhere out there that this is from Jenny's recall, Gertrude took them upstairs and started beating them, claiming, "I took care of you two for a week for nothing." It's like, okay girl, that was your job, but you do you. So after that basically opened the floodgates for the abuse. So basically Gertrude started using the paddle on Sylvia and Jenny. More so Sylvia. I'm not sure why she didn't beat on Jenny as much. I'm guessing she had some empathy, I don't know, for Jenny because she had polio. But either way, like, so she would use the paddle on them for various reasons. Just because they used soda bottles to exchange at the grocery shop, or one time Gertrude accused Sylvia of stealing. So she used a match and burnt the tips of her fingers. So this is the part where it starts to get a little more dark. So viewer discretion is advised. Basically, when Gertrude felt weak from her asthma to beat them, her oldest daughter, Paula, would help. And kids from the neighborhood would start to gather around and join in on the "let's beat up Sylvia" train. They would haul her against a wall, start beating her, kicking her, putting cigarettes out on her. And this is the part I've decided to put in the video just because it shows how, or not shows, but it explains how gruesome it was for her. She was forced to undress in front of them in the living room and take one of those old-fashioned empty Coke bottles and stick it where the sun doesn't shine. So after that horrendous experience for Miss Girl Sylvia, Gertrude and her little gang of goblins brought her up to the bath to give her a scalding hot bath to cleanse her of her sins. Now this bath, like I said, was scalding hot, so it burned her skin. And so then Gertrude decided that Sylvia was no longer fit for living upstairs with her children after the fact that Sylvia had wet the bed a couple times because of the trauma done to her body that they inflicted. And so Sylvia was thrown into the cellar of the basement and locked in, getting fed crackers. Poor Sylvia was tortured and beaten in that basement for a long time. And her parents had no idea because they were traveling with the circus and they just kept sending Gertrude money. The neighbor kids were involved in the beating and torture, and Gertrude told the neighbor kid and her own kids that Sylvia was a prostitute, and she was proud of it, that Sylvia was proud of it, and so it should just be etched into her skin. Yeah. So Sylvia was tied down, gagged, and Gertrude took a needle, got it really hot, and started carving her message, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," into her skin. Gertrude started the carving, and she gave the needle to a boy named Richard Hobbs to finish it. I believe he was 12, and he finished the carving, and she begged him to stop. Sylvia did, obviously. She begged him to stop, but he wouldn't, and it just gets worse from here. Honestly, it just gets worse and worse and worse until it stops. Her poor sister Jenny just had to watch as her sister was being relentlessly beaten, and Sylvia tried to escape multiple times, but each time was a fail, and it led in more beatings and more torture from Gertrude, from the neighbor kids, from her own kids, and Gertrude even tried to get Jenny to do harm, and she refused. We love that sisterly bond. She refused, and therefore Jenny got beaten, but not as nearly as bad as Sylvia, and Jenny still had free will around the house, unlike Sylvia, who was confined to the basement without food, no water, and without the right to use a restroom. So you can imagine how that ended. Once Gertrude figured out or realized that Sylvia was dying, she commanded her to write a note, and you can find this note online, and talking about how a gang of boys did everything that was on her body to her and not Gertrude, claiming that she caused Gertrude a lot of agony and being difficult to take care of, and causing Gertrude a lot of money that she didn't have, and just basically Gertrude making her lie. And the plan was for Gertrude to dump Sylvia somewhere with that note and be done with it. But that's not what happened, is it? This is one of the times that Sylvia tried to escape and was taken back to the basement and beaten. And she was beaten so badly that her brain started to hemorrhage, and she died on October 26, 1965. 2, 3, 4 months after they arrived at that house, she died. So Sylvia had over 150 wounds on her body found at the autopsy. Very fortunately, she was found guilty with first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. But in 1970, she was granted a retrial, and in 1971 the trial began again, but she was found guilty again. And in 85 she was granted parole, but there were 40,000 signatures protesting it. I mean, rightfully so. She's a monster. Later, in 1990, Gertrude died from lung cancer in Iowa on June 16th. Her daughter Paula, in that same first trial, was found guilty of second degree murder and was sentenced to life. But in 1971, her retrial began, and she was found guilty for involuntary manslaughter, or she pled guilty for involuntary manslaughter, and she was sentenced to 2 years to 21 years, and she tried to escape from prison twice, and she was later granted parole. So what sense does that make? I'm sorry, I feel like if you try to escape twice, they wouldn't give you parole, but clearly that's not the case. Stephanie Baniszewski voluntarily testified, and she was found not guilty and released. Coy Hubbard, Richard Hobbs, and John Baniszewski Jr. were all sentenced to manslaughter and were found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 2 to 21 years life prison. No, not life. 2 to 21 years. But they only served 18 months and were released on parole in 1967. Wow! So that is the Sylvia Likens story summed up. But if you want more details, there's a movie that was released in 2007 called An American Crime. You can find it on Netflix, I know for a fact, because I watched it. And it is solely based on that story. And it shows more details in depth of what happened to her and her sister. So if you are interested, I recommend watching that. And I thank you so much for watching. This has been Crime Time with Sage, episode 1. If you want to see more, let me know. I'll come up with more. Yeah. Bye!